Part 1. The Illusion of Everything. Imagine reaching the summit of human achievement celebrated across continents, immortalized in literature, embraced by wealth, fame, and family, only to realize that none of it could silence a single haunting question. What is the meaning of life? This was not a poetic musing for Leo Tolstoy. It was a crisis that shattered the very foundation of his existence. Most know him as the genius behind War and Peace and Anna Karenina, but few understand the agony that lay beneath his brilliance. At the height of his success, with the literary world at his feet and a family that loved him, Tolstoy began to feel an emptiness that grew darker with every passing day. In the silence between accolades and the glow of candlelight dinners, a whisper crept into his mind, unshakable, unrelenting. Why am I here? If everything ends in death, what is the point of any of this? For years, he tried to suppress it. He immersed himself in writing, in teaching, in raising his children. But the shadow followed him. He confessed in his diary that he could no longer live as he did. Even the beauty of the world, even the love of his family, could not drown out the inner scream. He had everything the world promised would bring fulfillment, and yet he felt nothing but despair. The more he achieved, the more he was tormented by the realization that death would eventually erase it all: his books, his legacy, even the memory of his existence. What remained then? Was all of life just a cruel joke, a brief flicker before eternal darkness? This question did not fade. It consumed him. And so began one of the most profound existential journeys in human history. Not in poverty, not in failure, but in the unbearable void of having everything and finding it meaningless. And that is what makes his story so deeply unsettling. Because if success couldn't save him, what chance do the rest of us have? Part 2, when success fails to save you. And that is what makes his story so deeply unsettling. Because if success couldn't save him, what chance do the rest of us have? Tolstoy's despair was not the result of suffering or failure, but of abundance. He had reached the summit of everything society glorifies: celebrity, creative mastery, intellectual prestige, and found it hollow. His books were hailed as masterpieces, his thoughts quoted by scholars, his name etched into the canon of human genius. But none of it could quiet the voice inside that whispered, "This is not enough." In his private journals, he wrote of feeling as though he were standing on a cliff's edge, staring into a black abyss. The abyss was not the fear of dying, but the terrifying realization that nothing he had done would survive death's erasure. No praise, no reputation, not even the love of those closest to him. All of it, eventually, would be gone. The inevitability of non-existence made every action feel futile. He tried to distract himself, writing more, parenting, managing his estate, but the darkness seeped through everything. Each joyful moment felt tainted by the knowledge that it would one day vanish. He was not ungrateful. He was not unwell. He was awake. And that awakening, for many, is unbearable. The myth that achievement leads to peace had shattered. And in its place, Tolstoy found only silence. Deafening, inescapable silence. He described it as losing the ability to live not physically but existentially. The world outside continued, full of laughter and routine, but inside he was collapsing. And still, he had not given up. Because somewhere deep inside, beyond logic, beyond fear, something stirred. A faint impulse that meaning must still be possible, even if he hadn't found it yet. And so, with reason failing him and despair closing in, he turned to the only place he had never truly explored: not the world outside, but the world within. Part 3, the dead end of reason. And so, with reason failing him and despair closing in, he turned to the only place he had never truly explored: not the world outside, but the world within. Tolstoy had spent his entire life as a man of intellect. He revered logic. He believed that the mind could solve anything. And so, as his crisis deepened, he did what he had always done: he read. He immersed himself in philosophy, searching for a framework that could anchor him. Plato, Socrates, Kant, Descartes, he dissected their ideas, hunting for a universal truth. Something objective. something unshakable. But each system contradicted the next. One thinker's certainty was another's illusion. Every answer opened into more questions. What is good? What is real? What is worth living for? No one could agree. And that was the revelation that broke something in him. If even the greatest minds could not agree on the most basic truths of existence, then perhaps reason itself was insufficient. Not wrong, not useless, but incomplete. He turned to science, hoping it could offer what philosophy had failed to provide. Science told him how the universe worked: atoms, gravity, biology, but it couldn't tell him why any of it mattered. It could describe existence, but not justify it. It could calculate the mechanics of the stars, but remained mute when asked why we longed to gaze at them. And in this mute silence, Tolstoy realized he had reached the limit of intellect. Reason could build great cities, discover planets, write symphonies, but it could not answer the question that had brought him to the edge: why live at all? The tools he had trusted most, logic, analysis, understanding, were powerless here. He was standing in a room filled with knowledge and starving for meaning. And so, paradoxically, it was in this moment of intellectual failure that something unexpected began to stir a question, not of mind, but of heart. What if the answers he sought were not hidden in books, but in lives, the quiet, overlooked lives of those who had never questioned the meaning of existence at all? Part 4. The people who knew without knowing. What if the answers he sought were not hidden in books, but in lives, the quiet, overlooked lives of those who had never questioned the meaning of existence at all? That thought disturbed him at first. How could uneducated peasants, those who couldn't read Plato or understand Descartes, live with more clarity and peace than the finest minds of his generation? Yet, as Tolstoy looked around, he saw something undeniable. These men and women who lived hard lives filled with labor and little comfort did not seem tormented by the abyss that haunted him. They woke, they worked, they prayed, they raised their children, and they did it all with a quiet sense of purpose. No philosophical systems, no intellectual pride, just life accepted, lived, and embraced. For a man who had spent decades building an identity around knowledge, this was both humbling and revelatory. How could those who knew so little live so well? What did they possess that he lacked? At first, he believed it was ignorance. But the more he observed, the more he realized it was something else entirely. It was faith. Not blind obedience to rituals, not superstitious fear, but a deep, intuitive conviction that life had meaning because it was part of something greater. Something they didn't need to define to feel. These people did not ask if life mattered. They simply lived as if it did. And in doing so, they revealed a truth that no theory had ever offered him, that meaning was not a conclusion you reached. It was a posture you lived from, a way of being, not a set of beliefs. Tolstoy was shaken. All his life, he had trusted intellect and dismissed faith as weakness. But now, he saw that perhaps the mind could dissect the world, yet only the heart could hold it together. The peasants had never tried to outthink death. They had simply embraced life in the face of it, and in that embrace, they had found what he had missed. A quiet, unwavering peace. Could it be, then, that meaning was never something to be proven but something to be trusted, even without proof? Part 5. A faith deeper than proof. Could it be, then, that meaning was never something to be proven but something to be trusted, even without proof? For Tolstoy, that possibility was both terrifying and liberating. He had spent a lifetime building his world on reason, believing that faith was a relic of the unenlightened, a crutch for those too afraid to think. But now, standing at the edge of his own mental collapse, he saw that reason had brought him only clarity without comfort, knowledge without peace. And so, reluctantly at first, he turned toward faith, not the faith of the institution, but the faith he saw lived in the faces of the peasants. A lived faith. A humble trust that life mattered, even if one couldn't explain why. He began to study the world's religions, not to convert, not to belong, but to understand. Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, he searched them not for dogma, but for essence. And what he found surprised him. Across cultures, across centuries, There echoed a similar voice, one that spoke not in rules, but in wisdom. Let go. Serve others. Embrace humility. Love without needing to possess. Find meaning, not in the self, but beyond it. He realized that faith, at its core, was not belief in the impossible. It was courage. The courage to live as if life were sacred, even when you couldn't explain why. Faith was not about accepting fairy tales. It was about committing to a way of being, a way rooted in love, in purpose, in connection. And that commitment was what the intellectual world had never offered him. Logic could ask the questions, but only faith could give him the strength to keep living while the questions remained unanswered. This shift did not come easily. He resisted it. He challenged it. He tried to tear it apart. But the more he fought it, the more he saw that what he was resisting was not irrationality, it was surrender. And that was precisely what he needed, not to escape reason. And so, with trembling hands and a questioning heart, Tolstoy began not just to think differently, but to live differently. And that, more than anything, would change everything that followed. Part 6. Breaking from the World. And so, with trembling hands and a questioning heart, Tolstoy began not just to think differently, but to live differently. And that, more than anything, would change everything that followed. Because the moment he began to embody his new truth, he came into conflict with the world he once belonged to. His family, his peers, his nation, all began to feel the weight of his transformation. The first to experience this shift was his wife, Sophia. She had stood by him through the glory years, managed his estate, edited his manuscripts, raised his children, and protected his legacy. But now, the man she loved was becoming unrecognizable. Tolstoy started speaking against private property, against wealth, against the very foundation of their aristocratic life. He gave away copyrights, rejected his status, and advocated for simplicity, poverty, even manual labor. To Sophia, this was betrayal, not just of their lifestyle, but of their shared identity. She begged him to reconsider not for her sake, but for their children. She accused him of abandoning his responsibilities as a husband and father, of chasing ideals that could never be lived. But Tolstoy saw her resistance as proof of how deeply society's values had corrupted even love. He believed that true love required detachment from possessions, from ego, from control. And so the home that had once been filled with laughter and creation became a place of silence and tension. Yet this conflict was not limited to his private life. As he grew more vocal in his critiques of organized religion, his words began to stir outrage beyond the walls of his estate. He argued that the church had betrayed the teachings of Christ, using religion to justify power, violence, and obedience to the state. To Tolstoy, the real message of Jesus was radical and clear: love your enemy, reject violence, embrace poverty, and serve others. He wrote essays that spread like wildfire, calling believers not to worship in temples, but to live in truth. And for that, the church excommunicated him. They publicly severed ties, denouncing him as a heretic. But instead of breaking him, it confirmed what he had come to believe. That truth was not something granted by institutions, but something revealed in the courage to live against them. Part 7. Excommunicated for truth. That truth was not something granted by institutions, but something revealed in the courage to live against them. And it was precisely this conviction that brought Tolstoy into open confrontation with the most powerful institution in Russian spiritual life, the Orthodox Church. For years, he had grown increasingly disillusioned with what he saw as a hollow performance of faith. He believed the church had twisted Christ's teachings into instruments of obedience, nationalism, and moral convenience. Where Jesus had preached humility, compassion, and love for one's enemies, the church now demanded loyalty to the state, endorsed violence, and accumulated wealth. Tolstoy's critique wasn't casual. It was relentless. Through essays, letters, and public declarations, he accused the church of betraying the very soul of Christianity. He argued that true faith could not be dictated from pulpits or controlled through ritual. It had to be lived in acts of love, simplicity, and nonviolence. For Tolstoy, the divine was not found in sacred buildings, but in the human heart, especially when that heart chose mercy over power. These ideas, though ancient in origin, were revolutionary in context. They threatened the status quo, undermined authority, and offered ordinary people a path to spiritual freedom beyond religious control. And so, in 1901, the Church acted. In a formal decree, Leo Tolstoy was excommunicated, stripped of spiritual affiliation, publicly denounced, and cast out from the institution he had once sought for solace. To many, such a sentence would have been devastating. But for Tolstoy, it was liberation. The Church had merely confirmed what he already knew, that the sacred could not be confined, that no human structure, no matter how grand, could contain the mystery of faith. In fact, it was this rejection that propelled him further into the life he was now committed to. He no longer saw himself as a writer of books, but as a writer of lives, his own, first and foremost. And as his ideas began to spread beyond Russia, what began as personal rebellion was quietly turning into a global revolution. Part 8, A Revolution of Simplicity. And as his ideas began to spread beyond Russia, what began as personal rebellion was quietly turning into a global revolution. Tolstoy's rejection of wealth, status, and institutional religion was not merely symbolic. He didn't just write about simplicity, he lived it. He gave away most of his possessions, dressed in peasant clothes, worked the land with his hands, and refused all titles and privileges. He opened his home to travelers, seekers, and the poor. His estate became a living philosophy, not of ascetic denial, but of radical alignment between belief and action. And people noticed. Across Russia and eventually around the world, groups formed calling themselves Tolstoyans. They read his essays, followed his lifestyle, and sought to embody his vision: nonviolence, service to others, rejection of materialism, and spiritual independence. One of these readers lived thousands of miles away in South Africa. A young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi read Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You and was profoundly moved. Gandhi saw in Tolstoy's moral clarity the blueprint for his own resistance, a way to confront injustice, not through hatred or war, but through peaceful defiance and unshakable integrity. They corresponded. Tolstoy, old and frail, and Gandhi, young and awakening, shared a vision that would soon shake the empires of the world. And yet, for all this influence, for all the essays, movements, and global admiration, Tolstoy remained uneasy. He saw how even his followers began to fracture, how his ideas were sometimes distorted, how society continued to march in the opposite direction. He was not chasing fame. He wasn't trying to be a prophet. He was trying to live honestly. That alone was his revolution. To live without masks, without compromise, without comfort bought at the cost of conscience. And that revolution didn't require weapons or armies, only courage. But even the most courageous souls are not immune to pain. And as Tolstoy aged, the tension between his ideals and the world around him reached a breaking point, leading him to make one final, irreversible decision. Part 9, The Final Departure. But even the most courageous souls are not immune to pain. And as Tolstoy aged, the tension between his ideals and the world around him reached a breaking point, leading him to make one final, irreversible decision. In the last years of his life, the conflict at home grew unbearable. His wife, Sophia, remained deeply wounded by his rejection of wealth and family privilege. Their once collaborative bond had eroded into arguments, suspicion, and emotional distance. Tolstoy, now in his 80s, was frail, tired, but still uncompromising. He had tried to live the truth as he understood it, but the burden of contradiction pressed on him constantly. He preached simplicity, yet lived in a house of servants. He spoke of humility, yet his fame only grew. Even among his followers, egos clashed, interpretations diverged, and purity gave way to politics. He longed for stillness not of the body, but of the soul. And so, one night in 1910, without telling anyone, Tolstoy slipped away. He left behind his estate, his writings, his name, his family. He took only a few belongings and boarded a train into the Russian countryside, headed nowhere in particular, only away. It was not an escape. It was a final act of alignment. A last attempt to embody the truth he had pursued for decades. But his body, already worn from age and illness, could not endure the journey. Just days after his departure, he collapsed at a remote railway station. He was taken to a small caretaker's home, where he lay in bed, surrounded not by accolades or applause, but by silence. His wife arrived too late. The world waited outside, stunned, while the man who had once redefined the novel now quietly prepared to exit the stage of life. And there, in that modest room, Leo Tolstoy took his final breath. A man who had walked away from everything to remain true to something greater than himself. And yet, even in death, one final question remained. Had he truly found the answer he was searching for, or had he simply refused to stop asking? Part 10, you must create your own meaning. And yet, even in death, one final question remained. Had he truly found the answer he was searching for, or had he simply refused to stop asking? In truth, perhaps the answer lies in the question itself. Because Tolstoy's life was never about arriving at certainty. It was about refusing to live without honesty. He never claimed to possess ultimate truth. What he embodied was something far more rare, the courage to search for it relentlessly, even when that search led him away from comfort, approval, and even love. His legacy is not just his novels, his essays, or even his spiritual defiance. It is the radical idea that meaning is not something we wait to receive. It is something we must choose to create. And that idea changes everything. We are taught to believe that one day, if we work hard enough, love deeply enough, or believe strongly enough, meaning will arrive like a reward. But what Tolstoy shows us is that meaning does not arrive. It emerges from the way we live, from the values we serve, from the sacrifices we make, and from the truth we dare to claim, even when the world cannot see it. He was not a man at peace. He struggled until the very end, with doubt, with contradiction, with despair. And yet, he continued to act, to serve, to speak, to live. Not because he had the answers, but because he believed the questions were worth living for. And that is the difference between despair and purpose, not the absence of uncertainty, but the willingness to walk through it with open eyes. So what does Tolstoy leave us with? A warning, perhaps, that success will not save us, that intellect will not fulfill us, that institutions will not redeem us. But more than that, a quiet invitation to stop waiting, to stop searching outside, to stop hoping for something to make it all make sense, and instead to choose a way of living that matters to you, to love, to give, to question, to serve, not because someone tells you to, but because your soul demands it. In the end, the meaning of life will not be something handed to you. It will be something you build with your own two hands. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most powerful answer of all. Top of form.